In this video, we are going to be discussing how to master big blind fundamentals. It is vitally important that whenever you are studying poker, that you study the situations that come up the most frequently. And one of the most common situations you're going to be in, that's actually kind of tough to play, is when someone raises, everyone folds around to you, and then you are in the big blind, out of position, closing the action. This is a spot that comes up a lot. And what most people do wrong is they play way too tightly, or alternatively, they play way too loosely. And I'm going to teach you in this video today how to play well both before the flop and after the flop. This video does discuss specifically when someone raises and everyone folds around to you. If someone raises and someone calls, or someone raises and someone re-raises, and then it gets around to you, that does not apply. That is now a multi-way pot. And we're going to have a video discussing how to master multi-way pots at some point in the future. Today, we are specifically discussing when someone raises and then it folds around to you in the big blind. First, let's discuss pre-flop defense strategies. And let's start with some broad, basic rules that you can use to adjust your strategies accordingly. First, you're going to want to defend with a tighter range as stacks are deeper. And that's because when stacks are deeper, if you make a hand like middle pair, you can't just check, call, check, call, check, call for a ton of money. Because if your opponent wants to put in a lot of money, middle pair is usually not in great shape. But if you have something like 15 big blinds, well, if you make middle pair, that's a pretty good hand because you don't have very many chips and you can confidently get your money in. This allows you to defend with a wider range as stacks are shallower and a tighter range when stacks are deeper. Next, as the raise size you are facing is larger, you should defend tighter because you're getting worse pot odds. You have to put in more money to see the flop. And as the raise size is smaller, you get to defend with a wider range. Next, when there is no ante in play, as is usually the case in a cash game, you should be defending tighter because the pot is relatively small. But in a tournament where there's an ante in play most of the time, you get to defend more often because the pot is going to be a little bit bigger. Basically, when the pot's bigger, you defend wider. When the pot is smaller, you defend tighter. Also, if there's a rake, let's say in a cash game, someone raises and you call, if the flop comes and the casino takes out 5% or 10% of the pot and puts it into their pocket, well, that's really bad for you. And that should make you defend tighter because the pot is smaller, right? And if there is no rake, you should defend wider. If you take a look at these first 4 points here, you typically play with deeper stacks in a cash game. You typically face larger raise sizes in a cash game. There's usually no ante in a cash game, and there's usually a rake in the cash game. And on this side, this is usually going to be the case in tournaments. So you're going to find that when you're looking at big blind defense strategies, you're usually going to be playing substantially tighter in a cash game than you are in a tournament. But interestingly enough, a lot of your opponents are not going to be doing that. They like to see the flop with all sorts of junk in a cash game, just trying to flop well. And, well, that's why they lose a lot of their money. You should also make a point to play a little bit tighter exploitatively if your opponent is tight. If they only raise with strong hands, you do not get to defend nearly as wide, right? Because they're going to be playing very strong hands only. It's hard to beat a good pre-flop hand. Also, if your opponent is especially strong, if you know they play good, strong, world-class poker, maybe you should tighten up just a little bit. Alternatively, if your opponent is loose, or if they're maniacal, right? If they're going to be putting a lot of money into the pot, or their ranges are just far too wide, you in turn can stick around with a wider range. And if your opponent is especially terrible, you can also defend with a wider range because they're going to be making all sorts of post-flop mistakes. All right, next we're going to be discussing how to play pre-flop when someone raises and it folds around to you 100 big blinds deep in a cash game. And then we're going to look at how to play a lot of common shallower stack situations in a tournament. In a cash game, you have to defend your big blind fairly tightly. And this is because you're playing relatively deep stacked, usually. We're presuming, for right now, you're playing 100 big blinds deep. And also, if you call, the casino is going to take some rake out of the pot, which makes the pot smaller, which means you're getting worse odds, which means you need to play tighter. You're usually going to be facing something like a 3 big blind raise or a 4 big blind raise, which is kind of big. And if you're facing a really big raise, like the 10 big blinds, as happens in some small stakes games, you need to defend super duper tight because you're getting horrible odds. And there's no ante in play. All of this is going to result in you playing quite tightly in a cash game. You're going to find also in a cash game, if your opponents play well, which this video is going to presume. We're presuming they're not making blunders left and right. And if they are making blunders left and right, you can hopefully figure out what they're doing wrong and crush them. When your opponents play poorly, it's not that tough to win. But if they do play well, and they're playing good, strong ranges from early position, you should actually 3-bet very rarely, because their early position raising ranges should be quite strong. That said, as they get in later and later positions, you should be 3-betting more often with your best hands, as well as a mixture of suited hands. Just to be clear, a 3-bet is a re-raise. So if they make it 3 big blinds, you're going to make it roughly the size of the pot, plus a little bit more. The way you figure out how much a pot size raise is 3 times the last bet plus any additional money in the pot. So let's say they make it 3 big blinds, 3 times 3 is 9, plus any additional money in the pot, which would be your big blind plus the small blind, right? So you're going to make it about 10.5 big blinds plus a little bit more because you're out of position. So maybe make it something like 14 big blinds, roughly 4 times their initial raise. If they made it bigger, like let's say they make it 5 big blinds and you wanted to re-raise, make it something like 18 or 19 or 20 big blinds. That's typically what you want to be doing, roughly a pot size raise plus a little bit more from out of position to disincentivize them from calling, because if they fold, it's okay. It's tough to play out of position with pretty much anything. So let's take a look at good, strong game theory optimal strategies. We're going to go a little bit slowly through these ranges because I want to be sure you fully understand exactly what we're looking at, and we'll go through the pre-flop tournament ranges a little bit faster. Okay, this presumes we're playing 100 big blinds deep, and this is against an under-the-gun raise, 8-handed. This is against a hijack raise, and this is against a button raise. The way the positions go are you're the big blind, then to your right is the small blind, then to their right is the button, then to their right would be the cutoff, and then to their right would be the hijack, okay? So this is sort of like middle position, right? So let's first start with this chart on the left. This is when under the gun raises. This is when the first player to act raises at an 8-handed table. The hands in red are re-raised to roughly the size of the pot plus a little bit more like we just discussed. The hands in green are called, and the hands in blue are folded. Again, this presumes under the gun raises and everyone folds to you. If there are callers in the middle, this will all change. Again, we'll be discussing that in the Mastering Multi-Way video at some point in the future. All right, let's take a look at which hands want to re-raise. Well, we see very clearly aces, kings, and ace-king suited re-raise every time, whereas some other hands are re-raising some portion of the time. For example, take a look at this ace-3 suited. It looks like it's re-raising about 15% of the time or so. And we see the other 85% of the time or so, it is calling. So you're going to want to mix it up with that type of hand. If you wanted to make some sort of implementable strategy here, maybe you re-raise ace-5 suited every time, and you call ace-6 suited, ace-4 suited, and ace-3 suited every time. It's not going to be exactly perfect GTO poker, but it's going to be a lot easier to implement. So you're going to find that the ace-X suited likes to 3-bet a decent amount, some king-X suited likes to 3-bet a decent amount, and some suited connected hands like to 3-bet a decent amount. So we see king-Jack suited, king-10 suited, king-9 suited, queen-10 suited, 10-8 suited, 8-7 suited, 7-6 suited, 6-5 suited, 5-4 suited, a random pocket sevens. These hands like to 3-bet a decent amount of the time. Notice ace-king offsuit against an under-the-gun raise actually does not 3-bet very often at all, because if you re-raise and they 4-bet you, it's not a great spot to be in, because your opponent's under-the-gun raising range should be very strong. Now, if they are raising all sorts of junk, meaning they're far too loose, you should be defending wider, which means you're going to be re-raising with a wider range, perhaps more like versus the hijack raise, maybe not quite this loose, but somewhere between these two charts, and you're going to be calling more often. I do want to point out hands that do not call against a 3 big blind under the gun raise with no ante in play with a rake involved. Take a look at this. Hands like queen 9 suited, jack 8 suited, 7-5 suited are not good enough to call. These are pretty good hands, but they're just not good enough to call against a strong under the gun range. And then you'll notice almost no offsuit hands call. That feels tight, but it is the game theory optimal strategy. Notice ace-jack offsuit and worse folds. King-jack folds. Queen-jack folds. Jack-10 folds. King-queen offsuit folds half the time. I'm not going to say you necessarily need to be this incredibly tight, because most people do raise wider than the under-the-gun GTO range. By the way, you can get the poker coaching app. If you are a poker coaching member, you'll have access to everyone's ranges in all these scenarios. You can look up all the ranges to your heart's desire. These charts are in there, as well as many, many more. And you'll see that under the gun has to be a raising with a very tight range. So if they are looser than that, you can defend wider, but you can't defend a whole lot wider. I think a lot of people make a big mistake of defending with stuff like ace-8 offsuit, 9-8 offsuit, 10-5 suited, stuff like that. And defending that wide against an early position range is going to result in you check folding far too often after the flop, and you're just going to be bleeding money. And most players in most games bleed a lot of money unnecessarily from the big blind because they call too wide pre-flop. They don't flop anything that's all that good, and then they end up check folding by the river far too often, and that is not good. You have to realize when you're out of position, you're going to under-realize your equity, meaning if you flop a hand, all your opponent has to do is bet and put you in a tough spot. If you make something like top pair marginal kicker and worse, if your opponent from early position wants to load the money in, they could easily have aces or top pair top kicker. And that is a very, very bad spot to be in because it's usually going to force you to fold out hands that, could be good, like middle pair. So you have to defend very, very tightly. Now, what if the raise comes from middle position, from the hijack? Now we get to defend wider. Not super duper wide. Notice we're still folding 75.4% of the time, but we are re-raising more often and calling more often. So we're re-raising now with a lot of the best hands, mostly that are suited. We see lots of suited Broadway hands, especially 2 cards, jack and higher, re-raising that are suited. Ace King offsuit now re-raises every time and just gets the money in. Also, 10s and better is a little bit happier re-raising and getting the money in. I should note over here, queens, jacks, 10s, etc. do not do much re-raising against the under-the-gun raise because you don't want to get the money in against a strong under-the-gun range. As your opponent's raising from a later position, they are going to have a wider range, and that lets you re-raise substantially more aggressively. We do still have some, call them bluffs mixed in with some ace-x suited, some king-x suited, a smattering of suited connectors, and that's usually going to be standard in these situations. Those are usually hands that very much like re-raising when you're playing deep stacked. When you're playing deep stacked, you want to be re-raising with hands that have some post-flop potential, which is why you don't see a whole lot of hands like ace-x offsuit and king-x offsuit re-raising, whereas you will see those hands re-raise as we get shallower stacked. Okay? Again, notice, against the hijack range, we do not defend all that many offsuit hands. We see jack 10 folding every time, 10-9 folding every time, ace 9 folding every time. These are just not good. And then obviously all the weaker hands fold too. We do get to defend a lot wider with suited hands though, and you're going to find that suited hands are usually pretty good, especially if they have some sort of straight potential. So now we see stuff like king 5 suited, queen 8 suited, jack 8 suited, 9-6 suited, 7-5 suited, 5-3 suited calling in this situation. What a lot of people do wrong in the big blind facing a raise is they call with stuff like jack 8 offsuit and then just check fold a lot of the time, and that's not good. You want to make sure you have some post-flop playability, and the great thing about the suited hands is that they let you flop flush draws and backdoor flush draws that you can more confidently play aggressively. You're going to find that you do a decent amount of check raising from out of position. We're going to be discussing that later in the post-flop section. Now, against a button raise, when the raise comes from the button, this is when they should be the widest, and it is therefore when you get to defend the widest, okay? When they are raising with a wide range, you in turn get to defend with a wider range, kind of like we discussed earlier, and they're naturally going to be raising wider from the button. So let's take a look at this. Now we are re-raising 9s and better, ace jack, ace 10 suited and better, ace queen offsuit and better, king jack suited and better, and king queen. Just nice strong value hands. And then a bunch of medium suited connected type hands. This is a rather interesting strategy, and almost no one re-raises correctly in this spot. If you give most players jack 10 suited, 10-9 suited, 10-7 suited, jack 7 suited, king 9 suited, most people call these hands every time because they think I don't want to re-raise and then get 4-bet and then have to fold. But you have to realize if you get 4-bet, you're probably super duper dominated, and you can just easily fold stuff like jack 7 suited or 10-7 suited. So these are very, very nice hands to re-raise because when you do get called, they flop extremely well. Like I said earlier, not a whole lot of offsuit hands are re-raising. We do see a little bit of offsuit junky bluffs with stuff like king, jack, king 10, ace 8, ace 5, but not a lot, right? Most of the bluffs are going to be tilted towards hands that flop very well when you are playing deeper stacked. Notice our calling range also gets wider, but not extremely wide. Notice still hands like ace 4 folding, 9-8 are folding, 8-7 are folding, 9-5 suited, 8-4 suited, 7-2 suited. All of these hands are folding, and that's again because we're facing a relatively big raise to 3 big blinds, and also there's no ante in play, and the casino is going to take a rake out of this pot. And because of that, we have to play kind of tightly. I hate to burst your bubble, but you don't get to call and try to see the flop with all sorts of junk. You just don't get to do it. I don't care what your opponents do. They're all losing money, and I want to be sure that you do not torch your money in these situations. And if you start with good, strong ranges, you're going to be very, very difficult to play against. Also, I want to make it really, really clear too, if your opponents raise bigger pre-flop, you should defend substantially tighter. Say they make it 5 big blinds pre-flop. That's just a regular raise in your games. Well, if that's the case, You're going to be defending tighter than all of these ranges recommend. And I realize that may not be the most loose, fun, splashy, battly poker, but it is going to help you defend your big blind way, way better. And that's going to result in you not getting crushed quite so hard when you are out of position. So anyway, this is how to play when you are playing 100 big blinds deep in a cash game. If you're playing deeper stacked in a cash game, we have charts for those as well in the poker coaching app. But the strategies don't change all that much, so I didn't want to spend too much time on it. Next, we're going to discuss how to play as stacks get shallower in a tournament. Compared to a cash game, you can defend much wider in a tournament because there's no rake in play, because there is no rake taken out of each individual pot in a tournament. They take that at the start of the tournament. And then also there is usually an ante in play. Also, you're going to be facing smaller raise sizes in tournaments. The following charts presume you're facing a 2.5 big blind raise or even a smaller raise. Of course, if your opponent's raise bigger, you would defend tighter, right? You're going to find that when you are playing with an ante, with no rake, facing a small raise, you now get to defend all suited hands. Notice that's very different compared to these cash game charts where lots of suited hands fold, right? Also, you're going to find that even though you get to play a lot of suited hands, the weak offsuit hands are still somewhat unplayable. You're also going to see that your 3-betting strategy changes a little bit too, where essentially your bluffs get a little bit weaker. They get pushed down the chart a bit more. So let's take a look at how to play 80 big blinds deep, which is comparable enough to when you're playing 100 big blinds deep. By the way, if you were playing a cash game with no rake, with an ante, with roughly 100 big blind stacks against somewhat small raise sizes, you would use these strategies because then you're essentially playing that game. So understand the fact that this is a tournament doesn't really matter so much. What matters is the actual structure of the game that you are playing. All right, here we have big blind defense, 80 big blinds deep. Against the under the gun raise, you get to play all suited hands. They all call. This may make some people very, very uncomfortable, but you get to call because you're getting better odds, right? If you're getting a lot better odds, you get to call much wider. You do still see that your bluffs mostly come from ace-x suited, king-x suited, and suited connectors. Same thing, right? Our value range is aces, kings, queens, and ace-king. Those are the hands that are good enough to re-raise and get in, even 80 big blinds deep. And then we're calling with a whole lot of other hands, right? We're just calling with all the hands that flop well enough. Notice hands as weak as 5-3 offsuit call, where stuff like Jack-4 offsuit does not call. That's because 5-3 flops way better in general than Jack-4. 5-3 makes some random straights and 2 pairs, whereas Jack-4 typically makes top pair no kicker or bottom pair bad kicker. It's not really where you want to be. So notice against the under the gun raise, a lot of these offsuit hands are just too weak to continue. Even some of the weaker ace-x has to fold. As you're facing a hijack raise, you get to defend a little bit wider with you 3-betting more value hands. Notice 10s and better and ace-queen for value now. But then also more bluffs, mostly from the middle suited connected type hands, and a few more ace-x suiteds, right? The calling range does continue to get a little bit wider in this scenario, just including more junky offsuit hands, but it's mostly connected or has a high card. So we're going to be sticking around a little bit wider. And then against the button raise, this is when you get to defend the widest. Notice you're only folding about 16.4% of hands. Not very much. You're really only folding the absolute trash, like Jack-2, 9-4, 7-4, 6-3, 4-2, 3-2, etc. Notice our 3-betting range does get way wider at this point. We're now 3-betting with 8s and better for value, a lot of suited and offsuit big cards for value, as well as a bunch of suited connected type hands as a bluff. We're going to see that as we get shallower stack, though, the bluffs are going to move from the suited connected hands over to more junky offsuit hands. We do have some junky offsuit hands like ace-6, king-6, king-5, jack-8, etc., but not a whole lot. And if you compare this to the cash game charts earlier, you see you really don't have very many offsuit junky hands re-raising at all when you're playing in a cash game because we are again, deeper and we're playing a tighter range to begin with. All right, so compared to a cash game, you're going to be defending a lot wider in a tournament. And as the raise comes from later and later position, which means it's coming from a wider and wider range, you in turn get to defend with a wider range. Now, let's discuss playing shallower stacked. Now we're going to be discussing playing 40 big blinds deep. You're going to find that playing 60 big blinds deep or 70 big blinds deep is kind of like playing 80. But once you start getting down to 40 big blinds, now you're going to see that you should just rip it all in with some hands when someone raises against you. And that's going to be especially true as the raise comes from later and later position. And usually the hands that are looking to shove are hands that are usually good, but very vulnerable to being outdrawn, or that will just play poorly post-flop. So let's take a look. Against the under the gun raise, you're still going to play quite tightly, right? We're just re-raising our best hands. Notice now we don't re-raise any ace-x suiteds, only one king-x suited, the king-9 suited, and not very many suited connectors. Instead, our bluffs are now going to come from a lot of the ace-x offsuit type hands and king-x offsuit type hands. And the reason for that is because as you get shallower, your opponent's going to be far more inclined just to shove all in on you. So post-flop playability doesn't really matter all that much when it comes to the hands you're looking to 3-bet. Whenever you're playing deeper stacked, notice a lot of our 3-bets come from ace-x suited, king-x suited, and suited connectors. These are hands that are going to flop well enough when your opponent does call. But whenever you start to get shallower and shallower stacked, your opponent's going to shove all in more often. And now you just want to block their shoving range. So you want to make it less likely they have a hand like ace-king or ace-queen or pocket aces or whatever that will continue in the pot, which is why we see ace-x and king-x mostly being our bluffs, because these hands don't play especially well post-flop, and they make it more difficult for the opponent to have a shoving hand or a calling hand. Okay? It's very, very important. Your bluffs are going to become offsuit junk hands as you get a little bit shallower. Let's take a look at from the hijack. We're going to re-raise wider for value. Again, lots of ace-x and king-x bluffs. Almost no suited connected bluffs at this point as well. Now we start to have a few shoves all in. We see 1.3% of hands go all in. We see king-9 suited, jack-10 suited, pocket-9s, and ace-queen offsuit shoving sometimes. Look, anytime some of your range makes a play 1.3% of the time, I don't think it's that necessary that you actually do that. But I just want to show it to you, right? Notice you are still 3-betting non-all-in a decent amount of the time, though. And when you do 3-bet non-all-in with your non-premium hands like king-jack, ace-jack, queen-9 suited, 10-8 suited, and your opponent shoves all in for 40 big blinds, you fold. Typically in the spot, someone will min-raise. You'll make it something like 7.5 big blinds. They'll go all in, and then you will let go of everything except for your pairs and better and ace-queen and better. Those are going to be the hands that call it off. Facing a button raise, now you're going to start shoving wider, right? Because their range is wider, so you're going to start shoving wider. And now we see a very common trend start to develop where a lot of small pairs go all in, even 40 big blinds. They make it 2, you make it 40 big blinds all in with pocket 9s and worse a large chunk of the time. Also, you're going to find that ace-queen, ace-jack, and more of these ace-x offsuit hands that are pretty good start shoving as well as we get shallower and shallower and as your opponent's ranges are somewhat wide. King-queen offsuit also shoves. Ace-2 offsuit feels dirty, but it's a shove. King-7 offsuit sometimes shoves, and a few suited hands. But what I wanted to show here, it's very important. As your stack gets shallower and shallower, your bluffs start to come more from the offsuit hands. And you're re-raising not all in with these hands, right? If you're short to the point that you have to just rip it all in or fold, well, then you're not going to be shoving it all in with stuff like 10-7 offsuit or jack-7 offsuit or queen-8 offsuit. But with a stack that you can still re-raise and fold to a shove, these are by far the preferred bluffs. What a lot of people do wrong in this situation is they re-raise hands like ace-5 suited or king-5 suited or 8-7 suited, and then they have to fold it when they get shoved on, but those hands have really good equity. Whenever you re-raise those and get shoved on, you lose your equity, and you don't get to play the hand, right? You really want to play hands like ace-x suited, 8-7 suited, etc. So make sure you're not re-raising those at this stack depth from the big blind. As we get even shallower, to 25 big blinds, you're going to be able to defend even a little bit wider. Also, as stacks get shallower, you're going to be going all in more often. That's because you're risking less money to try to win the pot. As you're risking less and less money, you in turn get to shove wider and wider. Also, obviously, as your opponent's range gets wider and wider, you get to shove all in more often, which is why we're shoving more often against the button compared to under the gun. 25 big blinds deep, though, we will still have some shoves against raisers of all positions, but you're going to be shoving much wider when the raise comes from a later position. Also worth noting, we're still going to have some non-all-in re-raises. A lot of players think that they should only go all in or call. They think they cannot re-raise small in this scenario and then fold to a shove, but you most certainly can. So let's take a look at, against an under-the-gun raise, 25 big blinds deep. We see queens and better, and ace-king suited, and some ace-king offsuit, some ace-queen offsuit, and some jacks. Re-raises for value, and then calls it off. And the bluffs that are re-raising not all in are entirely some junky ace-x, junky king-x, and queen-jack offsuit as a bluff. These are hands that you're re-raising and then folding. So 25 big blinds deep. Someone raises a 2, you make it something like 6.5. If they shove, you let it go with your non-premium hands. The nice thing about this strategy is that your opponents are not going to know if you have the nuts that's going to easily call off or junk that's going to easily fold. It puts them in a tough spot. Notice again, we are still calling with a whole lot of hands that flop well enough, and we're shoving with our hands that are very likely good but vulnerable. That's going to be a mixture of pairs, king 10 suited, ace king offsuit, and ace queen offsuit, plus a sliver of ace 4 offsuit for fun. Facing a hijack raise, we now see the same pattern again. Lots of pairs are shoving ace king, ace queen, ace jack, a few more ace x, a few more suited decent hands. We do still have a small re-raising range of mostly nuts and some ace x, king x, queen x, and jack x offsuit bluffs. From the button, or when the button raises, this is when we get to shove the widest. We see 10s and lower shoves every time. Lots of ace x shoves. Ace queen, ace jack, ace 10, ace 9, ace 5, 4, 3, 2. All offsuit shove a lot. King queen offsuit shoves, king jack offsuit shoves sometimes, king 7 suited, king 6 suited, king 5 suited, like the shove. And then we again see the best hands re-raising, right? Ace 10 suited and better, jacks and better, few suited connectors, but then a nice mixture of ace x, king x, queen x, jack x, and 10x bluffs. A lot of players do not re-raise these hands with bluffs ever, and it makes them very easy to play against. If you only re-raise with the nuts, you become super duper easy to play against. I want to make it really clear. If you look at all these charts, all of these charts have some non-all-in re-raise bluffs, and they're almost entirely from king x, ace x, queen x type junk, like king 4, queen 4, jack 4. Get it there with the jack 4. Have fun with. GTO approved. Now, when we get down to 15 big blinds, this is when we are going to defend very wide, but also we're going to shove all in a lot. And now we can no longer re-raise less than all in and still fold if we get shoved on. Because if someone raises to 2 and we make it, let's say, 5.5, and they shove, now we're getting 2-to-1 pot odds. We only need to win about 33% of the time. And most hands win about 33% of the time against decently wide ranges. So, in all the deeper stacks so far, we've seen non-re-raise or non-all-in re-raises. But now at this stack depth, we are going to be shoving or calling. No more small re-raise, all in. And we're going to see the hands that like to shove are usually the pairs. Pairs love to shove. And then a lot of ace x and maybe some king x suited. So let's take a look against under the gun. We're going to be pretty tight here. We're shoving all our pairs except for 5s, 4s, 3s, and 2s. Those call sometimes. Aces slow plays. One thing when you're playing a little bit shallower stacked, from the big blind, aces slow plays when you get very, very shallow, because by slow playing aces, it lets you defend a little bit wider because your range is a little bit stronger. Notice we are calling a lot, right? We're calling with all except for the worst offsuit hands in all these scenarios. Our all-in range against under the gun is ace, queen, and better. All the pairs, ace 8 suited, ace 7 suited, ace 5 suited, ace 4 suited, and king 10 suited, and some jack 10 suited. That's it. Still a pretty tight shoving range, right? But a pretty wide defending range, because remember, when they raise and you call, if you flop any pair, you check, they bet, you're just not folding if you make a pair. It's not hard to continue if you know, don't go around folding pairs when you get really shallow stacked. Against a hijack raise, you're going to shove a little bit wider. Notice against under the gun, we were shoving 8.3%. Against the hijack, we're shoving 13.9%. And against the button, we're shoving 18. So we shove wider as we are getting, or as we're against a wider range, right? So now again, all the pairs, lots of ace x, offsuit and suited. We see queen 10, queen 9, jack 10 shoving sometimes, which fine and good. You know, these are hands that are likely good but vulnerable, or they're not going to play especially well. So you rip those in. Now against the button, this is where you get to play the widest. We now see aces and kings slow play every time, but all the other pairs shove. Lots of ace x shoves. King 5 to king 3 suited shoves. King queen offsuit, jack queen jack offsuit, king jack offsuit, etc. Those hands all shove, and everything else calls except for the worst junk. Interestingly enough, notice in all of these charts, you're folding about 23% of hands, which is, again, a pretty similar range of garbage. So if you look at all these ranges, it's not so hard to kind of memorize which hands you fold. If you look at the ranges that are shoving, they're all shoving kind of the same stuff. Lots of pairs, lots of aces, right? And you know that as you're in later and later position, you shove more and more of the ace x and king x type stuff. So these strategies are actually kind of easy to remember, especially if you study and you quiz yourself. We actually have a pre-flop quiz at pokercoaching.com where you can go through and make sure you're playing all these situations well. And once you learn how to play these spots well, you're going to be well on your way to crushing your opponents before the flop. And once you're doing well before the flop, you just have to learn how to play well after the flop, and then your opponents are not going to be able to take advantage too much of the fact that you are out of position. So that's it. This is how you play well before the flop when someone raises and then it folds around to you. I've laid out all the common situations. We do have more situations in the poker coaching app, such as when you're playing with 20 big blinds or 12 big blinds or 10 big blinds or 60 big blinds. So make sure you do go through and reference those so you can see the subtle differences and changes as you get slightly deeper. But these are the common situations, right? And if you memorize the rough common situations, you can extrapolate a little bit for when you're against a cutoff raise, for example. We have charts for exactly when against the cutoff in the app, but you can extrapolate. So study these scenarios, make sure you understand them well, and you are going to be ready for post-flop play. Playing after the flop is quite difficult when you are out of position in general, and it's especially true when your range is kind of wide, as will be the case in the big blind. Look, as you look at post-flop scenarios, the number of situations you can look at expands substantially, right? Pre-flop, we covered a lot of common spots pretty quickly. Post-flop, we cannot cover all the spots because you could be playing shallow stacked, 40 big blinds deep like we're going to be discussing in this video, 60 big blinds deep, 100 big blinds deep, 200 big blinds deep. And then also, it matters what your opponent's starting range is because that will impact your defending range, but also their pre-flop range may be very tight if they're in early position or very loose if they're in late position. And that's going to also impact your strategy substantially. So look, we could cover infinite spots. Lots of spots are covered at pokercoaching.com in the tournament and cash game masterclasses for all sorts of stack depths. But we can't cover it all here today. We are going to be discussing specifically 40 big blinds deep in a tournament, okay? If you're playing a cash game, you're going to be a little bit tighter. We already showed how the pre-flop ranges are adjusted. We're going to be discussing when the low jack raises. The low jack is under the gun if you are playing six-handed. So middle position raiser, everybody folds to you. And now we're going to go through flops that are terrible for the big blind. We're going to go through flops that are, let's call it marginal for the big blind. And then we're going to go through flops that are interesting, kind of corner cases that line up very uniquely for the big blind. You'll see here, there's actually not a whole lot of flops that are actually good for the big blind. And that's because the big blind's range is lacking a lot of the good hands. I mean, if we go back here to the pre-flop ranges, notice we are going to be using a range something like this. Notice when we call pre-flop, it means we no longer have all of these hands in red. And all these hands in red are all the best hands, right? So the big blind's range is going to be lacking the best hands, but the raiser has all the good hands. And here we have a chart. The hands in yellow are the hands that the low jack should raise in this situation. So we're against a relatively strong range, and we, in the big blind, have a range that is missing a lot of the best hands, okay? Before we move forward, I want to make it crystal clear, you need to go and further study these situations. We are discussing specifically when the low jack raises and the big blind calls. It changes a lot depending on your opponent's position, depending on the stack depth, etc. So make sure you look at all these spots that are already covered on pokercoaching.com, like when you're shallower, when you're deeper, 3-bet pots, 4-bet pots, etc. We are discussing the most common situation where someone raises and then you call. So first we're going to look at the really bad flops, then the marginal flops, then the interesting flops. Let's discuss flops that are terrible for the big blind. First things first, what makes a flop terrible? Well, a terrible flop is a flop where the board lines up very well with your opponent's preflop range. So let's do a little bit of extrapolating here. If they have this preflop range in yellow, just all the best hands, which boards line up well for them? Well, it's going to be boards with an ace, boards with a king, boards with a lot of good middle connected high cards, right? If you consider the boards that are bad for them, where they don't really have a whole lot, that's going to be the low card boards. Notice your opponent does not have very many offsuit junky hands, but you in the big blind actually do, right? And you also have all the suited hands. So you're going to find that the high card boards and the uncoordinated boards in general heavily favor your opponent. And then boards that are usually lower and more connected are going to favor the big blind. So let's take a look at ace, jack, 9. In this situation, low jack raises, big blind calls, flop comes ace, jack, 9. The big blind checks with everything. You're going to find that you only get to bet into the initial raiser when the board is very good for your range. And we're actually going to show that does not happen very often at all. So you're going to check with everything. And this board is so good for your opponent that they're going to bet with everything, 100% of their range, for 25% of the size of the pot. A tiny bet. That's because they have what's referred to as a big range advantage. This board lines up so well with them and so poorly for you, they can bet frequently and small. They just want to nudge money into the pot. So, facing a small bet in this scenario, out of position, you actually have to fold a lot, more than you may like. Notice we have to fold the hands in blue 48% of the time. Yuck. So you see all of these hands, king high, queen high, 10 high, 8 high, lots of under pairs. All these hands just fold. All these hands completely miss this ace, jack, 9, no flush draw board. And you get out of the way. Against the small bet, though, you're actually going to raise a decent amount of the time. You see we're raising about 15% of the time. As you're facing a bigger bet, you would raise far less often. Typically how it works. But when you're facing a tiny bet, you're going to find that from out of position, you usually check raise with your best top pairs and better made hands, and then some draws. So look at what is check raising. We're check raising with, it looks like ace, 8, and better. Something like that, a large chunk of the time. And then we're check raising some draws. So what are draws here? It's going to be queen 10 and 10 8, right? So we see queen 10 is check raising some portion of the time. 10 8 is check raising some portion of the time. 8 7, that's also open-ended, check raises some portion of the time. And we do see a few other check raises with stuff like queen 8 for a gut shot and some bottom pairs. You're going to find that bottom pair with a weak kicker that's unlikely to be dominated when you do spike a kicker often goes for a check raise too, which is kind of cool. Notice we are not check raising our best gut shots here because hands like king, queen, and king 10, these actually have a decent amount of showdown value, so they don't necessarily need to check raise. You have to be careful check raising hands that would have to fold if you get shoved, so be very careful with that. We should note sizing, by the way. If you take a look at what we have here, just put a decimal before the last digit. So 40 big blinds deep. The darkest color red here is raise all in. We basically never do that here. Here we have raise of 7.7 big blinds. The opponent bet 1.5 big blinds, by the way. That is a 25% pot bet. So notice we're not doing that very often. Then we have raised to 5.1 big blinds. So they bet 1.5. We're making it 5.1 big blinds. Okay? They make a tiny bet. We're raising something like 3 to 3.5 times their raise in this situation. Then we have call and fold. Self-explanatory. But you do see, even against a small bet, you have to fold a lot. Notice stuff like backdoor flush draws does not get to continue. However, any gut shot type hand does. That's a really, really bad flop for the big blind, and they have to fold a lot. Notice here, I said the low jack bets 25%, or bets everything for mostly 25% pot. Sometimes, though, they're supposed to use a pot size bet. We're not discussing the low jack strategy specifically here. We discuss that in poker coaching. It's available for you if you go check it out. We're discussing big blind play in this video. So, against a pot size bet, when they blast it, notice you fold almost everything. Take a look at this chart. You're supposed to fold 67% of the time. That is nuts. So what's folding now? Notice, what do we do with our nines? Our nines fold a large chunk of the time. 10-9 folds. Ugh. Jack 10 folds. Middle pair. Queen Jack folds sometimes. King Jack folds sometimes. Oh my gosh. Could you imagine defending the big blind with King Jack and then check folding Ace Jack 9? It's what you're supposed to do against a pot size bet. Also notice we raise almost never. So against a small bet, we were raising about 15% of the time. Against a pot size bet, we were raising about 4% of the time. Almost never. And when we do raise, we're raising small. In this scenario, a pot size bet was, remember, 6 big blinds. So when they bet 6, we're making it 13. A tiny bit more than a min raise. That's going to be the case when we are playing roughly 40 big blinds deep or shallower. You're going to find that you do a lot of tiny raising with shallow stacks against big bets. But against a big bet, you really don't raise all that often. Because when your opponent bets using a big size, they're usually betting with a strong polarized range of good hands and draws. And against that range, you just don't want to raise. So now you see we're really just not raising all that often. And if we do have a bluff, it looks like it is with Queen 8 suited, and that's about it. Not a lot of bluffing going on in this scenario. But I did want to point out, like, everything folds. The gut shots fold for the most part, right? Like Queen 8 offsuit folds every time. Notice the 9s fold a lot, especially ones that are likely to be dominated. So we see Queen 9 folding, whereas we have stuff like 9-4 suited with a backdoor flush draw calling every time. And that's because if you do spike a 4, you're way more likely to be good compared to if you spike a queen when you have Queen 9. So that's kind of interesting to see. Even some jacks fold, though. That's also tight. Anytime I'm looking at these charts and I see like middle pair folding, I'm like, ugh, I don't know if I would have done that. But it is the GTO play. So Ace XX, where the other cards are like middle cards or unconnected cards, these are usually very, very bad flops for the big blind. Other bad flops for the big blind. Logically thinking, King XX, right? This is another board. In this situation, low jack bets everything for mostly 25% pot. So when you check, they bet 25% pot. You're, again, folding a lot, about half of the time. You're really only sticking around with a lot of the best hands. And again, common pattern, when they bet small, you check raise with something like top pair, decent kicker, and better, and then some bluffs. So what are bluffs on king 10-3 that don't mind raising and then either getting all the money in or raising and then folding? Well, that's going to be, what's that going to be? It's going to be flush draws mostly, right? In this spot, we have a lot of flush draws and then maybe some gut shots. So let's see what we have. We have Jack 9, check raising some, Jack 9 offsuit, Queen 9 offsuit, check raising some, which makes sense. These are gut shots. You can check raise and then fold if you get jammed. Then we also have a bunch of flush draws, check raising. These tiny slivers of red are mostly flush draws, check raising. And you're getting in with some of them, you're folding out some of them. And then usually you're going to want to have some trashy bluffs. So what are trashy bluffs? Well, trashy bluffs here are going to be, notice the 3-2, putting in the check raise, which is neat to see. Bottom pair, no kicker. Seems like it likes to check raise a lot at this stack depth. And then we have some random ace-5, ace-4, ace-3, and ace-2. Ace-3 is a pair, of course, but we see ace-5, ace-4, ace-2 check raising. These are going to have the ace of spades in them. So they can check raise the flop and then keep barreling when they feel inclined. Again, though, lots and lots of folds, not a whole lot of calls. We do call with under pairs in the spot. Feels kind of rough, really. You have to be careful with under pairs, by the way, like pocket nines, because even if you do spike a 9, you could still lose. It's not going to happen that often. But you only have 2 outs. You're drawing to 2 outs. And sometimes if you make a spade, it's not good, right? So you have to be careful with the under pairs. We do see against the small bet, the gut shots are continuing, like Queen 9 calls every time, Jack 9 sticks around. I say calls every time, but it sticks around every time. Same thing with Jack 9. Notice Ace Jack and Ace Jack check calls. It does not need to raise because you really don't want to check raise Ace Jack and then fold it to a shove because that hand has lots of equity. Okay, that said, again, bad flop, we check fold a lot. Against a small bet, we're check raising top pair, good kicker and better, and then a smattering of draws. One more bad flop. Queen Jack 10, this nails the opponent's range. You're going to be folding a ton. And in this spot, against the 55% pot bet, which is interesting, that's the size they mostly use. In this situation, we fold 60% of the time. That is a lot. It's depressingly a lot. So, Queen Jack 10. Notice a lot of the jacks fold. The only jacks that call are jacks with backdoor draws. Basically, every 10 folds, it doesn't have additional equity. That is depressing. Notice we don't get to raise all that often because this bet is not quite pot, but it is bigger than the 25% pot bet. So we're raising pretty infrequently, and when we do raise, we have a straight, top pair good kicker, 2 pair, and then flush draws with straight draws for the most part. Then we have a few King X bluffs as well, probably with a backdoor heart draw. So we got to be pretty tight on boards that do not connect with the big blind's range very well at all and do connect with the low jack's range. You have to be cautious. So on flops that are terrible for you, you do not a whole lot of raising, not a whole lot of calling, and a lot of folding. But some flops are going to be a little bit better for you. These are going to be boards that contain more middle cards. So let's suppose the low jack raises, big blind calls, flop comes queen, 6, 4, 2 spades. Big blind still checks everything. Low jack will, again, bet everything for roughly 25% pot. Now, compared to the previous scenarios where you were folding 45% of the time or so, now you're going to be continuing way more often. Also, before you were raising maybe 15% of the time or so, now we're raising about 20-something% of the time. So let's take a look at this. Against a small bet of 1.5 big blinds, you're going to be raising to about 5 big blinds 21% of the time, a pretty good amount of the time. So let's take a look at what likes to raise. Again, against a small bet, top pair good kicker and better likes to raise. But on this queen 6-4 board with a flush draw, you have a lot of draws available. Notice we have lots of flush draws in this region are raising, and we also have a lot of straight draws. So stuff like 8-5, 7-5, 8-7, 7-3, 5-3. These hands like to raise a large chunk of the time. Notice in this spot we also have a few interesting bluffs that I would not naturally consider. Notice we have a lot of backdoor flush draws that opt to raise. We have a lot of ace X and a lot of king X that go for the raise because the ace X and the king X with the ace or king of spades actually has pretty good equity because if you get an ace or a king and you make top pair, that's probably good if you raise because you have to remember whenever you check raise your opponent, they're going to fold out a lot of the time. And if you get a spade on the turn, you can keep bluffing a large chunk of the time because you would have check raised with a lot of flush draws, which would have made the nuts. So you want to make sure you have bluffs on lots of various runouts. And whenever you turn a flush card, so there'd be 3 spades on the board, you definitely want to keep betting with your flushes, and you want to keep betting with some bluffs. And the best bluffs to keep betting in that spot are bluffs with good equity, the ace or the king of spades. So this is a spot where you get to check raise a lot. Notice we're folding far less often as well, just because we have more stuff on this board, because the 6 and the 4 lines up very well with our middle connected range in this region. So we get to stick around pretty wide. Let's take a look at another similar board, Jack 6-5. We have a similar spot where we check raise about 20% of the time. We check call a large chunk. We check fold about 30%. So another spot where the board lines up very nicely with us. On Jack 6-5, you see we're check raising a lot of jacks and better. In general, as your top pair is a little bit more vulnerable to being outdrawn, you typically check raise a little bit more often because it's probably good, but if a king, queen, or jack comes, king, queen, ace, king, or queen comes, you are not so happy about it, right? So on Jack 6-5, what likes to check raise? Well, notice we have 7-4, check raising a lot for an open-ended. We have 8-7, check raising a decent amount. 9-8, 9-7 for gut shots. We see sporadic 10-8 and 10-7 check raising. Those seem a little bit loose. But then we see a bunch of random overcards with some backdoor draws. Like we see Queen 8 with a backdoor draw, Queen 7 with a backdoor draw, King 7, King 8, King 9, etc. And again, you're going to find that an overcard or 2 overcards, like we see King Queen suited here, with a backdoor flush draw really does like to check raise some portion of the time. These are very nice hands to put in a check raise, because if you get called and you spike an overcard to make your top pair, it's almost always good. And with the backdoor flush draws, those hands are going to be able to continue logically bluffing on lots and lots of runouts, especially if they have a backdoor straight draw to go with it. Like King 8, for example. Notice when you check raise King 8, if you get a, let's say, a spade on the turn giving you a backdoor flush draw, you can keep betting. If you get a king, you have a really good hand. If you have a queen, that's probably pretty bad for your opponent. Maybe you bluff it. But then also, notice if you get a 9, you have a gut shot. If you get a 7, you have a gut shot. And if you get a 4, you have a gut shot. So there are a lot of cards that these hands continue bluffing, which is why you get to play more suited hands pre-flop than you do offsuit hands. Notice in this spot as well, because the board is so good for you, you get to continue with basically any pair, which is different compared to when the board was not good for us, right? Remember when the board was not good for us at all because the opponents have a whole lot of top pairs and whatnot. In that situation, we had to fold out a lot of our bottom pairs and even some middle pairs. But in this scenario, we get to continue with all pairs because our opponent's range is not going to line up so well with the Jack 6-5 board. So these are marginal boards for us. They're not so good to the point that we're favored. And to be fair, you're never really favored when you're in the big blind on any flop. But these are boards that are okay for us, and we do have to stick around more often, and we do get to play more aggressively in these spots. Now let's discuss flops that are interesting for the big blinds. These are ones that play a little bit differently than common scenarios where the board is not paired, or there's not 3 flush cards available, or it's not very, very good for your range. Let's first discuss how to play the spot that is very, very good for your range. This is going to be when it comes all low connected cards, usually where the ace is not a gut shot. So this is going to be stuff like 7-6-5, 6-5-4, 7-6-4, stuff like that. In this situation, as stacks get shallower and shallower, the big blind gets to lead, bet into the preflop raiser a decent amount of the time using a small bet, because this flop is a situation where the big blind has a decent amount of nuts and or effective nut hands. Essentially, they're pushing the fact that they have a bit of an advantage with some portion of their range. And we see in this spot, they're actually betting with all sorts of stuff. They're betting using a small size for the most part, with lots of pairs, lots of straight draws, lots of random overcards. And this is because this is a board that does not connect well with the opponent's range at all. Now, this is because we are against a low jack raiser. If we were against a button raiser, whose range is wider, you would think that may mean weaker, but it doesn't, because as their range widens, it contains more low and middle cards, right? So against an under the gun raiser or a low jack raiser who doesn't really have a whole lot of hands that connect with 7-6-5, you get to lead a decent chunk of the time. But if the opponent's range was wider and therefore contained more middle and low cards, you would not get to lead nearly as often. But this is a spot where you should be betting a decent amount of the time. And I think a lot of people do not do this. A lot of people lead randomly. They just don't know why they're leading. But you want to lead when you have a range advantage and when you have a nut advantage, when you have a lot of nut hands in your range, especially that your opponent does not. That said, when the big blind checks, as they will do with all these hands in green, right? The low jack will bet roughly 45% of the time using a tiny bet. Now, this is a weird spot because when the low jack bets kind of infrequently, that means when they do bet, they're usually betting with their best hands and some draws. So logically, if you know your opponent's range is their best hands and some draws, you just don't get to raise all that often, right? Because if you raise and they want to put their money in, it's pretty bad for you because they're going to show you a lot of hands like overpairs or top pair or good draws. So when you know your opponent's betting infrequently, assuming they're betting logically with a polarized range of their best hands and draws, you don't get to raise, but instead you do get to call a lot against a small bet. So notice we are calling about we're folding about 36% of the time, calling 55, raising only about 7% of the time. So what is not calling? That's what we want to ask here. Are there any hands that you may think should call that do not? Well, notice a lot of the random overcards do not continue. So like King 10, this is a hand that has not a whole lot of potential, right? If you do get a king or a 10, you could easily be dominated, so that hand just gets out of the way. Notice even the gut shots with an ace, king, queen, jack, or 10. With the 3, did I say that right? Even the threes for the low end of the gut shot opt to just get out of the way because when the opponent does bet, they're going to have a lot of hands containing an 8, right, as their draws. So when they do bet with an 8, if you do call with a 3 and a 4 comes, well, you have the bad end of the straight, and that's especially bad. So those hands are ditching it a lot of the time, too. Ace high with nothing going on, king high with nothing going on, those hands opt to fold. But everything else calls, for the most part, in this situation against a small bet. If you, for whatever reason, faced a bigger bet, you would be way more cautious, right? The hands that do opt to raise in this scenario are raising to about 8.7 big blinds in this situation. Maybe I actually have their bet wrong. Maybe they're betting 5 point. Maybe they're betting 55% pot. I may have this slightly off. My bad, whatever. We are not raising all that often in this scenario is what it amounts to. All right, let's take a look now at King 9-3 all spades. This is a spot where the big blind checks everything. And then the low jack bets 85% of the time using mostly a small bet. However, we have to raise this spot pretty infrequently because a lot of the hands in our range are just dead against a flush. So hands like top pair go way down in value when there is a flush already available because your opponent could easily have you beat already, and their draws are all going to have some equity against you, right? So in this spot, if you take a look at our raising range, it's almost entirely flushes, which are really good, ace high flush draws and queen high flush draws, which are pretty good, 2 pair, which is obviously pretty good, and then we have some pretty interesting bluffs in this situation with 4-3, 3-2, 5-3, 6-3, 7-3, and 8-3. Interesting. I would not logically think the bottom pairs love to bluff on the 3 flush boards, but it turns out they very often do, especially when they're usually pretty live if they check raise and get called. But realize in this spot, your range is very well protected because you're also check raising a whole lot of flushes. And when you check raise a whole lot of flushes, your opponent doesn't get to re-raise you all that often. So we're not re-raising all that often, but when we do, we usually have a flush, a good flush draw, or a junky bottom pair. You're going to find that's almost always what the GTO strategy does when it raises. It usually has really good hands. It also has really good draws, and it also has some junky draws. But on the 3 flush boards, it turns out the bottom pair is usually the junky draw. You are still calling a decent amount in this scenario. Any hand with a spade, usually it's sticking around. Any pair is also usually sticking around as long as it has some sort of a spade with it with the under pairs. Notice like pocket 5s with no spade does just fold. So you much prefer to have a spade, or you want to have a pair on the board. Next, let's take a look at a few paired boards. These are interesting because the big blind gets to do a whole lot of check raising on the boards where they have a lot of trips, but the opponent does not, which against the low jack, this is going to be on the low and middle card paired boards. So let's say the flop comes 6-3-3. Big blind checks, low jack bets everything for mostly 25% pot. Now, notice lots of the trips raise. Not all of them, but a whole lot of them, right? And when you raise with a whole lot of trips, you also get to raise with a whole lot of draws. So which draws are raising? Well, any gut shot, lots of backdoor flush draws, lots of random overcards. This is a spot where you're going to be raising aggressively to try to put your opponent in a tough spot where they're ace high and king high and unpaired hands. And there's not a whole lot they can do really because they don't have any 3s. If we go back to our opponent's range, notice, look at this preflop range they have. They have almost no 3s in their range at all. They have a lot of overpairs, but they don't have a lot of threes. So this is an example of a spot where we have what's referred to as a big nut advantage, even though we don't necessarily have the range advantage. So in this spot, we are sticking around a decent amount of the time against a small bet. If they bet bigger, we would raise a little bit less often, and we would fold a little bit more often. But against a small bet, you do have to stick around pretty wide, and we are check raising with a lot of our sixes and better made hands, lots of trips, and then lots and lots and lots and lots of draws, usually with some backdoor equity to go with them. Notice hands like King 9 suited raises, whereas King 9 offsuit does not, because King 9 suited can keep barreling on lots of turns when it makes a flush draw. What about Queen Queen 2? This is an interesting board because now the opponent has a lot of trips, but so do we. So we're going to be check raising with lots of queens, lots of draws. There really aren't a ton of draws in this spot though. But we have to do a lot of folding, because if you look at a lot of our hands here on Queen Queen 2, we don't really have a whole lot going on with stuff like 9-6, 9-5, 8-5, 7-4, King 7. These hands are in very, very bad shape. So on the 6-3-3, we were folding only 27% of the time, but on the Queen Queen 2, we're folding a lot because the opponent's gonna have a lot of trips, and because a lot of our other hands just have nothing going on. And when you have nothing going on, you do need to get out of the way. Again, notice a lot of our raises in this spot either have backdoor straight draws with the queen or the 2, or they have a backdoor flush draw. So we see stuff like King Jack raising pretty frequently because King Jack has a lot of backdoor straight draws, right? We also see some Ace X putting in the raise immediately, and stuff like 5-4, 5-3, and 4-2 suited that have straight draws with the 2. Notice also some of the bottom pairs raise too. Whenever you're check raising lots of trips, usually the other card raises as well. The other card on the board raises as well. What about one more? Here is an interesting spot where the flop comes ace 5-5. Big blind checks almost everything. They do actually lead every once in a while on this board because they have a lot of 5s, and we actually have a lot of aces. If you look at our range here, we have a lot of aces and we have a lot of 5s, which lets us lead some portion of the time. That said, we check most of the time. Low jack bets about half the time using a tiny bet. We're going to, again, be raising very, very polarized with some good aces and better, including all of our 5s, and then some draws. And on ace 5-5, we have a lot of logical draws. You're going to find this is a pretty common pattern. When it comes with a flush draw, you're usually going to be raising your flush draws, then also some backdoor flush draws that can easily keep bluffing when that third spade comes. And on the ace 5-5, another logical draw is the gut shots. So we do see 4-3, 4-2, and 3-2 suited raising basically every time. We also see a few other perhaps illogical draws that maybe you're not check raising, like 7-6 check raising and 6-4. But again, these have backdoor straight draws, right? So backdoor straight draws in this spot usually go for a raise too. I realize we've not covered every single flop that could possibly come, but we've been through 3 very different types of boards. We have the flops that are terrible for the big blind, lots of generally cautious play. Then we have flops that are medium for the big blind. We have slightly more aggressive play, slightly more loose play. And then these interesting spots are definitely worth noting as well because they do come up a decent amount of the time. We discuss this again at pokercoaching.com a ton. We go through a lot more situations with different stack depths, different opponent positions, etc. But this is a very good framework to getting you started playing when you check the big blind and the opponent bets. But now, I want to discuss what happens when you check and the opponent checks it through. What do we do then? Finally, in this video, let's discuss how to play when the flop checks through. We're going to be discussing specifically low jack raises, big blind calls, check check on the flop. What are we looking at on the turn? Well, when the flop checks through, it kind of presumes the big blind has their entire range because we're not leading all that often, right? Whereas the initial raiser is usually going to be missing their best hands. Again, I know we did not cover what the initial raiser would have bet with in this video, but they're usually betting with their best hands in basically all scenarios. So, because they're missing their best hands, but the big blind still has their best hands, this allows the big blind to bet some portion of the time. And usually, you're going to be betting using a pretty big size when you're not betting the turn all that often because you don't have much of an advantage. Essentially, you're betting with your best hands and your draws, right? Usually in that scenario, you're going to be betting big. That's going to be when the turn is not great for you. And you're usually going to be betting more often and using a smaller size when the turn is good for you because you just straight up have a range advantage. We went through a bunch of spots earlier where you check and the opponent bets every time. We're not covering those spots here because they would have bet. We're not going to be in the spot where it checks through. And if it does check through, it means your opponent's not playing all that well. So good for you. Figure it out from there. Typically when it does check through, people don't have anything very good most of the time. That said, we are going to cover a few spots and a few turns where they will check back on the flop, and then we'll get to the turn. So let's say low jack raises, big blind calls, flop comes, jack, 6, 5, and it checks through. Turns a 10. 10's not so good for the big blind because the 10's going to line up a lot with the various high cards that the low jack's going to have. So we don't get to bet all that often. But in the spot, jacks are almost always good. So you're going to want to bet, and you're going to want to bet big. So we're betting infrequently, only 23% of the time. But when we do bet, we're betting either pot, 5.9 big blinds, or over pot, 8.8 big blinds. This is a spot a lot of people do not use a big bet size. They just bet half pot or something like that. But you have to realize your jacks are almost always good because your opponent would have bet almost all of their jacks on the flop. And because we're betting all of our jacks, we also get to bet with some draws. So what are logical draws here? Well, it's going to be king, queen, queen, 9, 9, 8, 8, 7, 7, 4, and then some low junky gut shots, 4, 3, 4, 2, and 3, 2. Makes a lot of sense, right? And I think this is a very logical strategy. We check everything else, and then we blast it with a lot of good hands. Notice we do still check some jacks, especially the weaker ones, and we check a lot of middle pairs with the 10. We also check a lot of 6s and 5s. So these are hands that we're going to check and then call if the opponent bets. What about on the turn 4? Well, this turn is excellent for the big blind because now they have lots and lots of straights and pairs and draws, and the opponent probably doesn't have much of anything because they let the flop check through. So notice now we're using a smattering of bet sizes, but we are betting 60% of the time on this jack, 6, 5, 4. Notice we're betting almost all of our 3s and almost all of our 7s as bluffs. We have a lot of those. We're also betting a lot of our 8s as gut shots, right? So we're betting all those draws. And when we can go for value very easily with stuff like 7-4 for bottom pair with a straight draw, or 7-5 middle pair with a straight draw, or any jack can certainly go for value. So we are betting very, very, very frequently in this situation because the turn is very good for our range. And notice we're using a lot of smaller bet sizes in general and almost no overpot bets in this spot because we have a range advantage, right? We're just betting with a lot of our range that is in pretty good shape on average. Let's take a look at 7-6-5. This was the board that's very good for us. On 7-6-5 jack, that's a pretty rough turn for the big blind because when it goes check, check, the opponent's going to have a whole lot of jack X, right? And ace X, king X, queen X, jack X, etc. So they're going to have a lot of top pairs, so we don't get to bet all that frequently. I know this chart's going to be a little bit hard to see because we would have led with some of our hands on the flop, remember? But we do get to lead infrequently, about 30-something, 40-something% of the time, with a smattering of bet sizes. But when the turn is really good for the opponent, to the point that they're going to have a lot of stuff that can reasonably call, and their check back range on the flop is kind of strong, you don't want to use a big bet in that spot. This is one of the interesting corner cases. But you see we're betting with a smattering of stuff, generally tilted towards pairs and straight draws and flush draws, right? What about on 7-6-5-4? We get to bet basically everything. That's kind of nuts, right? Using a small bet. We get to bet basically everything because the opponent's not going to have a whole lot of pairs, and we have a lot of straights, and we have a lot of 2 pairs, and we have a lot of sets. And that allows us to bet small with everything. Anytime there's a 4 straight on the board and the opponent doesn't have much of it, you get to be pretty aggressive. This is a spot where a lot of people, if they have a 5 or 6, they just check and hope to check it down. But don't do that. Just bet everything. When there's a 4 straight on the board that's good for you, you need to be betting frequently. If you check call to flop bet, actually, and the turn's a 4, you should actually be leading very frequently. Because in this situation, you have a lot of straights and the opponent has almost none. When you have a lot of nuts and your opponent has almost none, you get to bet a lot. Let's talk about the King 9-3 board, all spades. This is a board that should get bet a lot of the time from the opponent, but sometimes they'll check. But in this situation, when they do let it go check, check, you don't get to bet all that often because they're going to be sitting there with some slow plays that's going to crush you. And they have a lot of flush draws and pairs that will also crush you. So on King 9-3, 7 of clubs, so King 9-3 all spades, but then 7 of clubs, we are going to be doing a ton of checking, 80% checks. When we do bet, though, we're going to be betting using a big bet size, roughly pot. And we are potting it with essentially flushes and then 2-pair type hands and then draws. These are going to be hands like Jack 10 with a spade, Queen 10 with a spade, some ace high flush draws. Stuff like 8-6 for a gut shot, or I'm sorry, open-ended with a flush draw. And that's going to be a pretty nice strategy. So when we're bet with all of these suited hands, we have a lot of flushes. When we bet with these hands that are offsuit, we're going to have a lot of straight draws and flush draws. That is a pretty good draw. Nice, strong, polarized range. On the 2 of spades, this is an interesting card because we have a lot of flushes, but so do they. However, they're usually going to bet a lot of their ace high and queen high flush draws on the flop. So interestingly enough, we see a whole lot of small bets on this 4-spade turn. And that's because we have a lot of these ace X and queen X that are very, 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 very good, which allows us to bet substantially wider. Interestingly enough, though, we're betting with a lot of bottom pairs. Definitely a weird spot, definitely a little bit counterintuitive, but we're betting with flushes and then some bluffs. What are bluffs? Well, there's stuff like bottom pairs that can improve to trips and sometimes win. Also, they're hands that block the opponent's auto calls with stuff like random 2 pairs and sets that they're going to have. So definitely a weird strategy here, but I did want to show it. We're not going to go through every hand. You can pause the video. I know this video is long, but I did want to show that scenario because it's definitely a weird one. All right, one more. The ace-5-5 board. This is a board that will check through a decent amount of the time. When it does check through on a 10 of clubs turn, this is a spot where we're going to be betting infrequently, but when we do bet, we're going to be blasting it because our hand is almost always good, but a little bit vulnerable to being outdrawn because a lot of hands that check back on the flop are going to be some weak ace X that are not going to fold, but then also some hands like king queen and king jack that just turned a gut shot on the 10 of clubs turn, or some flush draws that didn't want to bet and get raised. So in this spot, we're going to be betting with a lot of trips that are almost always good, and then also a bunch of flush draws and a few gut shots. Notice when we do bet on this turn, we're betting big because we're super duper polarized, right? We have a lot of hands that are junk that can't do anything, but when we do bet, we're betting using a big size. On the 2 of diamonds turn, this is a cool spot too. Similar scenario, except for now our bluffs are going to be very different. So instead of bluffing all the flush draws and some random high cards like queen jack that were a gut shot on the 10, now on the 2, we're going to be betting with a lot of hands that have a 4 or 3 in them as a bluff for a gut shot. And this puts the opponent in a pretty nasty spot if they have anything worse than an ace. I mean, I want to make it clear. Pots 6 big blinds, we are betting 8.8. We are over potting it. We are applying a lot of pressure because we have a whole lot of trips and the opponent does not. And in spots where you have a big range and or nut advantage, that's usually the times you're going to be betting with a lot of your strong hands, plus some draws using a big bet size. So look, I know there was a lot of content in this video. These were just the fundamentals. I hate to break it to you. Poker is a tough game, but look, this video will set you off to the fast track to success to learn how to play the big blind well. Go back, rewatch this video, bookmark it, share it with your friends. If you enjoyed the video, click the like and subscribe buttons below. And if you want to study more, please check out the tournament and cash game masterclasses at pokercoaching.com because we discuss these situations thoroughly because they come up all the time. And if you mess them up even a little bit, it's going to cost you a ton of money in the long run. But if you don't, you're going to extract a lot of value every time your opponent messes these spots up. Good luck in your games. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate each and every one of you for being here. And I'll talk to all of you next time.